Today is August the 10th. Is it okay to get even? Let's find out together as we study Jesus' words. So today, reading again from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, we find a very, very interesting passage. Matthew chapter 5, starting to read in verse 39, we see these words. You've heard that the law says the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, don't resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. If you're sued in court and your shirt is taken, give your coat as well. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. Give to those who ask. Don't turn away from those who want to borrow. This is repeated in the book of Luke. Luke chapter 6, verse 29 and 30. If someone slaps you on one cheek, offer the other cheek also. If someone demands your coat, offer your shirt also. Give to anyone who asks. When things are taken away from you, don't try to get them back. There are differences between Matthew and Luke. One of the differences is that in Matthew we have the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5 verse 1 says, one day as he saw the crowds gathering, Jesus went up on the mountainside and he sat down. His disciples gathered around him and he began to teach them. And then he gives the Sermon on the Mount. And in the Sermon on the Mount, he has this passage where he says, don't try to retaliate when someone does you wrong. In the book of Luke, in chapter 6, verse 17, when they came down from the mountain, very different situation, the disciples stood with Jesus on a large level area surrounded by many of his disciples and by the crowds. This is the Sermon on the Plain. And much of what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, he repeats in Luke, but in a different setting. Mountain, plain. Why does he do that? I know when I have a favorite sermon, something that just really resonated, I don't preach it just once, I preach it several times. And that's apparently what Jesus is doing here. Slightly different context, slightly different wording, same basic idea. Jesus says here, don't retaliate. He says also in the Sermon on the Mount, love your enemies. The very next paragraph in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 43. You've heard that the law says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you'll be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. Love your enemies. Luke says the very same thing. Luke chapter 6, verse 27. To you who are willing to listen, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who hurt you. And because of that, we see a third command. Do good to those who are doing evil to you. Luke chapter 6, verse 35, love your enemies, do good to them, lend to them without expecting to be repaid. Now, why would Jesus say these things? Why would he say, don't retaliate? To understand that, we have to go all the way back to the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 3 is the story of the fall of man. In Genesis chapter 4, it's the story of how sin pervades humanity. So in Genesis chapter 4, verse 19, one of Adam's descendants was named Lamech. Lamech married two women. The first was named Ada. The second was Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal, who was the first of those who raised livestock and lived in tents. He's the father of the clan of those who domesticated animals but were nomadic. His brother's name was Jubal, the first of all who played the harp and the flute. So Jubal is the father of the creatives. And now we begin to see music being created. Lamech's other wife, Zillah, gave birth to a son named Tubal-Cain. He became an expert in forging tools of bronze and iron. So we have the creatives, we have the farmers, and now we have industry, forging bronze and iron. One day Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. Listen to me, you wives of Lamech. I have killed a man who attacked me, a young man who wounded me. What did the young man do? He attacked Lamech. So Lamech responds by killing him. If someone who kills Cain is punished 7 times, then the one who kills me will be punished 77 times. Lamech brags to his wives about how he did what someone did to him and so much more. The other injured Lamech, so Lamech killed him. Now perhaps because of that, when we come to the book of Leviticus, we get Levitical Law, Leviticus 24, starting to read in verse 19. Anyone who injures another person must be dealt with according to the injury inflicted. A fracture for a fracture, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Whatever anyone does to injure another person must be paid back in kind, in value, literally. 2 things that happen here. First of all, the Levitical law, when it says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, it's not to say make sure that if someone puts your eye out, you put their eye out. It's to say that's the maximum you can do. It's not like Lamech, where someone injures you, so you kill them. No, the punishment must relate to the injury dealt. And then finally, in that context, Leviticus says, pay them back in value. The idea is not if your eye is taken out by someone, that they are to lose an eye. It's there to be paid. They are to make restitution in kind. Some seem to think that they would take the value of a slave who was whole and a slave who had just one eye. Evaluate the difference in the cost of that slave, and that was to be the fine to the person for the injury that they inflicted. It was a judge who was to levy that decision, and it was to be a compensation for the injury done. Now, when we come to the New Testament, we seem to get a new way of doing things. In the new way of doing things, what Jesus says is no vengeance. Matthew chapter 5. Don't retaliate. Love your enemies instead. No vengeance, no retaliation. Our response is to be a response of love. When we love our enemies, they stop being an enemy, don't they? That's what Jesus tells us to do. Take our enemies, treat them as friends. Find a new way to live that eliminates the violence that is in the tit-for-tat system. So, my question to you today, who do you need to forgive? Who has injured you that you need to learn to love? Like, follow, and subscribe to this podcast on whatever device you used to listen to it. Email your questions to us at questions@becomehope.com. Tomorrow, we'll answer the question, why can't I stop worrying?